We want to know Jesus. That's why we're taking all this time to study the Bible. This isn't just for academics, this is for relationship. We love Jesus and we want to know him better. And obviously, if we are going to know Jesus, we have to know Jesus' story. And his story starts in the Old Testament. Actually, it starts obviously well before that because he is the eternal Son of God. But he reveals his story to us in the Old Testament, and yet the Old Testament is not complete. We need more if we're going to understand really who Jesus is and what Jesus has come to do. And so we need to turn our attention now to the Gospels. And we are so privileged because we have 4 different Gospels. And as you know, when we talk about the Gospels, we're talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There is the Gospel that we preach, and then there are the Gospels that we preach that reveal to us who Jesus is. And these Gospels are 4 different accounts explaining who Jesus is and why he made such an impact. And right now we're going to just look at one of the Gospels, and that is the Gospel of Mark. In the early church, apparently Matthew was one of the favorite Gospels. Mark wasn't quite as popular, or at least, I don't know if that's fair to say. It wasn't as widely quoted by church leaders as Matthew was. And yet, obviously, the Gospel of Mark is very important because God's given it to us as a way of trying to get a better picture, of helping us get a better picture of who Jesus is and what makes him so significant. And personally, I love it. It was the first gospel that I ever preached, and I think that it's one of the Gospels that's especially exciting to listen to. It's very straightforward, the Gospel of Mark. In fact, one of the best parts of reading the different Gospels is that each of the writers is unique, and they're trying to help us see and appreciate Jesus in different ways. It's like God chose 4 men, and they were all different, and so they all saw different things in Jesus, and they were especially excited about different things in Jesus. I mean, in general, obviously the same things, but in particular, like with anyone, there were certain things that really stood out to them. And it's so sweet to look at the 4 different Gospels because each author draws out different facets of Jesus's character. And Mark is very straightforward and fast. He doesn't pull any punches. It's got all kinds of action and interesting stories. It's almost breathless, at least at first. It feels like one story is coming at you right after the other. And so you can read it quickly and get a picture of who Jesus is and what Jesus has come to do, because in a sense, it is a simple gospel, and yet at the same time, it's also a gospel that you can take a long time studying because it's deep. Now, obviously, like with all the other Gospels, in terms of authorship, technically the Gospel of Mark is anonymous. If we were to get an idea of the background to this book, we usually like to begin by knowing who wrote it. And because in the Gospel of Mark, the author doesn't identify himself, the best way we can know who actually wrote the book is by listening to church tradition, which is unanimous. That's why it says at the top of our Bibles, the Gospel according to Mark, because that's what people have always thought all the way back to the hundreds. There was a leader in the early church named Papias, and he had the privilege of interviewing some of the leaders who had come before him, and he wrote down some of what he learned. And listen to what he says about Mark. This also, the presbyter or elder, and the elder he's talking about seems to be the Apostle John. And he says, John said, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward, as I said, he followed Peter, who adapted his teaching to the needs of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account of the Lord's discourses, so that Mark committed no error while he thus wrote some things as he remembered them. For he was careful of one thing, not to omit any of the things which he had heard, nor to state any of them falsely. Another church leader named Clement, who was born around 150 A.D., wrote, the Gospel according to Mark had this occasion. As Peter had preached the word publicly at Rome, and declared the gospel by the Spirit, many who were present requested that Mark, who had followed him for a long time and remembered many of his sayings, should write them out. And having composed the gospel, he gave it to those who had requested it. So both Clement and Papias and really every other church leader as far back as we can go all basically agreed that Mark wrote Peter's gospel, which makes sense in terms of the gospel itself. One way we can test the tradition is by looking at the gospel and seeing if there's any evidence within the gospel that fits. And it seems like really there is. For one thing, even though Mark wasn't an eyewitness, it reads a lot of times like an eyewitness account, the Gospel of Mark. For example, listen to Mark 3:5. What details do you notice in this passage? And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched out his hand, and his hand was restored. Here we see Mark telling this story about Jesus, and he describes his look, how he looked. And he looked angry and yet grieved. That's pretty specific. That seems like the only a kind of detail that an eyewitness would know. Mark 5:41, taking her by the hand, he said, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And so here Mark records that he spoke in Aramaic and that he took her by the hand, how he even healed her. Mark 7:33, and taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears and after spitting, touched his tongue. So there, that he put his fingers in his ears and that he touched his tongue. Mark 6:39, then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. The green grass. That's a lot of specific details. And there's a lot of Peter here. He's the first apostle mentioned. The first big healing is that of his mother-in-law. He's the one searching for Jesus in Mark chapter 1. His confession is at the center. It's always Peter and then the other disciples. And yet, even though he's here at the front, he's also kind of put down a lot in this gospel, Peter, which makes sense if he's humble and if he's the one behind it, which also matches up with what we know about Mark's life. There's a lot of details. There's a lot of Peter. And when we look at Mark's life, there's a clear connection between Mark and Peter. We don't know a lot about Mark, but what we do know about him is that while he wasn't an apostle, which is actually part of what would make this strange if the book wasn't written by Mark, because why would anybody say it was written by Mark if it wasn't? He wasn't an especially important person in the early church, at least not like Peter or John or Matthew. But what we do know about him, we know a little about him actually from Peter. In 1 Peter 5, he describes Mark as his true son in the faith. We don't know a lot about Mark. We know a little more about Mark actually than Matthew, though. He wasn't an apostle, that's one thing we know. And yet, while he wasn't an apostle, he did go back pretty far in the early church. Not all the way to being one of Jesus' original disciples, but it seems like his mother had become a follower of Jesus at a very early stage. In fact, in Acts 12, we read that the apostle Peter was put in prison and close to being killed when an angel of the Lord rescued him. And after he got out of prison and came to himself, that's how Luke says it, verse 12, says he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many were gathered together and praying. And he was so familiar, Peter, to the people who lived in that house. When the servant girl heard his voice, she was overjoyed. She didn't even open up the door, but she ran back to everyone else and said that Peter had shown up. And so Mark's mother was an important part of the early church pretty much from the beginning, and his cousin as well, who we know was Barnabas. And Barnabas at one point got Mark a position, I don't know, maybe you'd call it an internship, traveling with him and the Apostle Paul as well. And you know the story, but this is one of the great conflict scenes in the New Testament because Mark apparently missed his mother or something while they were traveling and had abandoned Paul and Barnabas, and so Paul didn't want Mark to travel with him any longer, though Barnabas did. And at that point, Paul and Barnabas couldn't agree over Mark, and so they separated. And yet the good news is that either Mark matured or Paul changed his opinion, or a little bit of both, because by the time Paul writes his final letter, 2 Timothy, we read, chapter 4, verse 11, "Get Mark and bring him with you, for he's very useful to me for ministry." And so Paul loved Mark, and actually so did Peter. Peter calls, as I said, Peter calls Mark in 1 Peter 5 his son, which indicates the depth of their relationship, and also the fact that probably at that point Mark was living in Rome and part of the church there. Peter says in 1 Peter 5 verse 13, "She who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does Mark, my son." And Babylon, many people think, is a veiled reference to Rome. In fact, in the ESV Study Bible, we read that Babylon almost certainly refers to the church in Rome, not a literal woman, or I guess not the literal Babylon either. Although Babylon in the Old Testament was in ruins, the reference resonates with the Old Testament, where Babylon represents a center of earthly power opposed to God, and in Peter's day that city would be Rome. And so because of that, along with a number of other reasons, many people are convinced Mark actually wrote this gospel as a kind of summary of Peter's teachings, first specifically for the church in Rome. That was the intended audience, at first at least, the Roman church. Now again, like the author, the book itself doesn't say for this church or for this audience. And yet, like with the author, church tradition is uniform. There isn't one single church leader who disagrees. All of them agree about the author. All of them agree that it was written for the church at Rome. For example, Eusebius, writing around 325 AD, says, "In the same reign of Claudius, the providence of the universe guided to Rome the great and mighty Peter, preaching the gospel. But the hearers of Peter were not satisfied with a single hearing, but with every kind of exhortation besought Mark, seeing that he was Peter's follower, to leave them a written statement of the teaching given them verbally. Nor did they cease until they persuaded him, and so became the cause of Scripture called the Gospel of Mark." And like with the authorship of Mark, as we look at the book itself and evaluate the tradition, we see some hints that the tradition is correct. Like, for example, one thing seems clear as you read the book of Mark, and that's that his audience didn't know Aramaic or Hebrew and were unfamiliar with certain Jewish customs, which of course was different than Matthew. Matthew was written for the Jews, and as a result, Matthew didn't have to explain a lot. But Mark did. Mark 3:7, he says, James, this is just an example, James, the son of Zebedee, John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder. And he has to explain what it meant because it's an Aramaic nickname, and he knew his audience wouldn't know Aramaic. Mark 5:41, when he takes the little girl by the hand, again he says, Talitha Kumi, and then he has to say, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And there are all kinds of other examples like that. He has to explain Jewish traditions. Mark 7, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. He's talking about the Pharisees. And then he says, for the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. He has to explain this because he knows the people wouldn't be as familiar, the people to whom he was writing wouldn't be as familiar with that. He's not writing to people who were Jewish or familiar with Jewish customs, though he does seem to be writing to people who were familiar with the Old Testament. So he can say things like Mark 1:2, as it's written in Isaiah the prophet, and not have to tell them who Isaiah is. Or Mark 2:25 and 26, he talks about David and Abiathar and a certain Old Testament story, and he doesn't really offer a lot of explanation there, because while they weren't Jews, he seems to assume here and a lot of other places they were familiar with the Old Testament, and that may be because they were God-fearing Gentiles, like some of the people we read about in the Gospel or Acts, like the centurion Peter himself visited actually, or maybe they were Christians and part of the church already. They definitely seem to be familiar with some of the major Jesus traditions, like they might have heard some of the things he said before. He doesn't have to say much about John the Baptist, for example, in comparison to how John explains him. And yet there are other more minor characters he does have to introduce or give some background on, like Mary Magdalene or Joseph of Arimathea. Mark's writing to non-Jews primarily who were familiar with the Old Testament to a certain extent, and they were familiar to some of the major things surrounding Jesus, while not all of them, and who most people think were living in Rome. And they say not only because of Paul calling Mark to him in Rome, and then because of Peter speaking of him as being with the church at Rome, but also because of evidences within the book itself, like the fact that the book has a number of Latinisms. For example, in Mark 12:42, he talks about a poor widow who came and put in 2 small copper coins, which he says makes a penny. And the word that he actually uses there was a Latin term for a Roman copper coin. Or later, in Mark 15:16, he says the soldiers led Jesus away inside the place that's the governor's headquarters, which he literally describes as the Praetorium, which again would have been a Roman way of speaking. In Mark 8:26, he introduces us to a Gentile Greek woman and describes her as a Syro-Phoenician by birth. Now, for people who spoke Greek in many parts of the world, they wouldn't have needed that addition of Syro. They would have just called her a Phoenician. But apparently, for those living in Rome, they were more familiar with another Phoenicia that would have come to mind because it was closer to them. And so Syro would distinguish where this lady was from, especially for Romans. A maybe more subtle indication he's writing to Romans is Mark 15:21, where he mentions they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And the interesting part there is the fact that he says the father of Alexander and Rufus, because if you turn to Romans 16:13, you see that Rufus was well known to the church at Rome. Paul says, "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, also his mother, who's been a mother to me as well." And then finally, Mark counted time the Roman way as well. Mark 6:48 says, "And about the 4th watch of the night he came to them." And the normal Jewish way of speaking would have only included 3 watches of the night. And then maybe the most subtle, but I think most significant clue he might have been writing first for the church at Rome is the fact that Mark starts off his gospel by talking about Jesus as being the Son of God. And then all the way through, it's Jesus. Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? He's the Son of God. All right. And then at the end, who is the very first person to confess, to really see, yes, Jesus is the Son of God? Mark 15:39. And when the centurion, a Roman, stood facing him, saw the way in which he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." And so that's like Mark bringing in a Roman as a witness, a testimony to the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus is the Son of God. Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? Listen to this Roman. He is the Son of God. In terms of the background to the book, the tradition says it's Mark writing for Peter to the Roman church. And looking at the book, it doesn't seem like there's any reason at all to question that, which maybe you're thinking is interesting, but I actually also think is kind of helpful because it can give you a clue as to the purpose of this book. The fact that Mark was writing first to a Roman audience will help you understand why he writes the way he writes about Jesus. And we'll talk about that in our next video.